Volume 2, Chapter 13 of Rob Roy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 13. General, hear me, and mark me well, and look upon me directly in my face, my woman's face. See if one fear, one shadow of a terror, one paleness dare appear but from my anger to lay hold on your mercies. Bonduca. We were permitted to slumber out the remainder of the night in the best manner that the miserable accommodations of the alehouse permitted. The Bailie, fatigued with his journey and the subsequent scenes, less interested also in the event of our arrest, which to him could only be a matter of temporary inconvenience, perhaps less nice than habit had rendered me about the cleanliness or decency of his couch, tumbled himself into one of the cribs which I have already described, and soon was heard to snore soundly. A broken sleep, snatched by intervals, while I rested my head upon the table, was my only refreshment. In the course of the night I had occasion to observe that there seemed to be some doubt and hesitation in the motions of the soldiery. Men were sent out as if to obtain intelligence, and returned apparently without bringing any satisfactory information to their commanding officer. He was obviously eager and anxious, and again dispatched small parties of 2 or 3 men, some of whom, as I could understand from what the others whispered to each other, did not return again to the Clachan. The morning had broken, when a corporal and 2 men rushed into the hut, dragging after them, in a sort of triumph, a Highlander, whom I immediately recognised as my acquaintance the ex-turnkey. The Bailie, who started up at the noise with which they entered, immediately made the same discovery, and exclaimed, "Mercy on us! they have gripped the poor creature Dougal. Captain, I will put in bail, sufficient bail for that Dougal creature." To this offer, dictated undoubtedly by a grateful recollection of the late interference of the Highlander in his behalf, the captain only answered by requesting Mr. Jarvie to mind his own affairs, and remember that he was himself for the present a prisoner. "I take you to witness, Mr. Osbaldistone," said the Bailie, who was probably better acquainted with the process in civil than in military cases, "that he has refused sufficient bail. It's my opinion that the creature Dougal would have a good action of wrongous imprisonment and damages again him, under the Act 1701, and I'll see the creature righted." The officer, whose name I understood was Thornton, paying no attention to the Bailie's threats or expostulations, instituted a very close inquiry into Dougal's life and conversation, and compelled him to admit, though with apparent reluctance, the successive facts: that he knew Rob Roy MacGregor, that he had seen him within these 12 months, within these 6 months, within this month, within this week, in fine, that he had parted from him only an hour ago. All this detail came like drops of blood from the prisoner, and was, to all appearance, only extorted by the threat of a halter and the next tree, which Captain Thornton assured him should be his doom, if he did not give direct and special information. "And now, my friend," said the officer, "you will please inform me how many men your master has with him at present." Dougal looked in every direction except at the querist, and began to answer, "She canna just be sure about that." "Look at me, you Highland dog," said the officer, "and remember your life depends on your answer. How many rogues had that outlawed scoundrel with him when you left him?" "Oh, not abune 6 rogues when I was gane." "And where are the rest of his bandity?" "Gane with the lieutenant again to Western Carles." "Against the Western clans?" said the captain. "That is likely enough. And what rogue's errand were you dispatched upon?"
"Just to see what your honour and twa gentlemen redcoats were doing down here at the Clachan." "The creature will prove fause hearted after all," said the Bailie, who by this time had planted himself close behind me. "It's lucky I didna pit mysell to expenses anent him."
"And now, my friend," said the Captain, "let us understand each other. You have confessed yourself a spy, and should string up to the next tree. But come, if you will do me one good turn, I will do you another. You, Donald, you shall just, in the way of kindness, carry me and a small party to the place where you left your master, as I wish to speak a few words with him on serious affairs, and I'll let you go about your business, and give you 5 guineas to boot." "Oh! oh!" exclaimed Dougal in the extremity of distress and perplexity.
"She canna do that, she canna do that. She'd rather be hanged."
"Hanged then you shall be, my friend," said the officer, "and your blood be upon your own head. Corporal Cramp, do you play provost marshal. Away with him." The corporal had confronted poor Dougal for some time, ostentatiously twisting a piece of cord which he had found in the house into the form of a halter. He now threw it about the culprit's neck, and, with the assistance of 2 soldiers, had dragged Dougal as far as the door, when, overcome with the terror of immediate death, he exclaimed, "Shentlemans, stops, stops! She'll do his honour's bidding, stops!"
"Awa with the creature," said the Bailie; "he deserves hanging mair now than ever. Awa with him, corporal, why dinna ye take him away?"
"It's my belief and opinion, honest gentleman," said the corporal, "that if you were going to be hanged yourself, you would be in no such damned hurry." This by dialogue prevented my hearing what passed between the prisoner and Captain Thornton; but I heard the former snivel out, in a very subdued tone,
"And ye'll ask her to gang nae farther than just to show ye where the MacGregor is. Ahone, ahone."
"Silence your howling, you rascal. No, I give you my word I will ask you to go no farther. Corporal, make the men fall in front of the houses. Get out these gentlemen's horses, we must carry them with us. I cannot spare any men to guard them here. Come, my lads, get under arms." The soldiers bustled about and were ready to move. We were led out along with Dougal in the capacity of prisoners. As we left the hut, I heard our companion in captivity remind the captain of "to 5 guineas." "Here they are for you," said the officer, putting gold into his hand; "but observe, that if you attempt to mislead me, I will blow your brains out with my own hand."
"The creature," said the Bailie, "is waur than I judged him. It is a warldly and a perfidious creature. Oh, the filthy lucre of gain that man gies himself up to! My father the deacon used to say, the penny siller slew mair souls than the naked sword slew bodies."
The landlady now approached, and demanded payment of her reckoning, including all that had been quaffed by Major Galbraith and his Highland friends. The English officer remonstrated, but Mrs. MacAlpine declared, if
"she hadna trusted to his honour's name being used in the company, she would never hae drawn them a stoup of liquor. For Mr. Galbraith, she might see him again, or she might no, but weel did she wot she had small chance of seeing her siller; and she was a poor widow, had naething but her custom to rely on."
Captain Thornton put a stop to her remonstrances by paying the charge, which was only a few English shillings, though the amount sounded very formidable in Scottish denominations. The generous officer would have included Mr. Jarvie and me in this general acquittance; but the Bailie, disregarding an intimation from the landlady to
make as muckle of the Englishers
as we could,
for they were sure to get us plaguing you,
went into a formal accounting respecting our share of the reckoning, and paid it accordingly. The captain took the opportunity to make us some slight apology for detaining us. If we were loyal and peaceable subjects, he said, we would not regret being stopped for a day, when it was essential to the king's service. If otherwise, he was acting according to his duty. We were compelled to accept an apology which it would have served no purpose to refuse, and we sallied out to attend him on his march. I shall never forget the delightful sensation with which I exchanged the dark, smoky, smothering atmosphere of the Highland hut, in which we had passed the night so uncomfortably, for the refreshing fragrance of the morning air, and the glorious beams of the rising sun, which from a tabernacle of purple and golden clouds were darted full on such a scene of natural romance and beauty as had never before greeted my eyes. To the left lay the valley, down which the Forth wandered on its easterly course, surrounding the beautiful detached hill, with all its garland of woods. On the right, amid a profusion of thickets, knolls, and crags, lay the bed of a broad mountain lake, lightly curled into tiny waves by the breath of the morning breeze, each glittering in its course under the influence of the sunbeams. High hills, rocks, and banks, waving with natural forests of birch and oak, formed the borders of this enchanting sheet of water, and, as their leaves rustled to the wind and twinkled in the sun, gave to the depth of solitude a sort of life and vivacity. Man alone seemed to be placed in a state of inferiority, in a scene where all the ordinary features of nature were raised and exalted. The miserable little borroughs, as the Bailie termed them, of which about a dozen formed the village called the Clachan of Aberfoil, were composed of loose stones, cemented by clay instead of mortar, and thatched by turfs, laid rudely upon rafters formed of native and unhewn birches and oaks from the woods around. The roofs approached the ground so nearly, that Andrew Fairservice observed we might have ridden over the village the night before, and never found out we were near it, unless our horses' feet had gane through the rigging. From all we could see, Mrs. MacAlpine's house, miserable as were the quarters it afforded, was still by far the best in the hamlet, and I dare say, if my description gives you any curiosity to see it, you will hardly find it much improved at the present day, for the Scotch are not a people who speedily admit innovation, even when it comes in the shape of improvement. The inhabitants of these miserable dwellings were disturbed by the noise of our departure, and as our party of about 20 soldiers drew up in rank before marching off, we were reconnoitred by many a beldam from the half-opened door of her cottage. As these sibyls thrust forth their grey heads, imperfectly covered with close caps of flannel, and showed their shrivelled brows and long skinny arms, with various gestures, shrugs, and muttered expressions in Gaelic, addressed to each other, my imagination recurred to the witches of Macbeth, and I imagined I read in the features of these crones the malevolence of the weird sisters. The little children also, who began to crawl forth, some quite naked, and others very imperfectly covered with tatters of tartan stuff, clapped their tiny hands, and grinned at the English soldiers with an expression of national hate and malignity which seemed beyond the years. I remarked particularly that there were no men, nor so much as a boy of 10 or 12 years old, to be seen among the inhabitants of a village which seemed populous in proportion to its extent; and the idea certainly occurred to me that we were likely to receive from them, in the course of our journey, more effectual tokens of ill will than those which lowered on the visages and dictated the murmurs of the women and children. It was not until we commenced our march that the malignity of the elder persons of the community broke forth into expressions. The last file of men had left the village to pursue a small broken track formed by the sledges in which the natives transported their peats and turfs, and which led through the woods that fringed the lower end of the lake, when a shrilly sound of female exclamation broke forth, mixed with the screams of children, the whooping of boys, and the clapping of hands, with which the Highland dames enforced their notes, whether of rage or lamentation. I asked Andrew, who looked as pale as death, what all this meant. "I doubt we'll ken that ower soon," said he. It means that the Hieland wives are cursing and banning the redcoats, and wishing ill luck to them, and ilka ane that ever spoke the Saxon tongue. I have heard wives flyte in England and Scotland. It's nae marvel to hear them flyte onygate, but sic ill scraped tongues as their Hieland carlines, and sic gruesome wishes that men should be slaughtered like sheep, and that they may lap off their hands to the elbows in the heart's blood, and that they should die the death of Walter Cumming of Gio, who hadna as muckle o' him left thegither as would swear a messing dog. Sic awesome language as that I ne'er heard out of a human hrapple, and unless deil were rise amang them to gie them a lesson, I think na that the talent at cursing could be amended. The worst o't is, they bid us aye gang up the loch, and see what we'll land in." Adding Andrew's information to what I had myself observed, I could scarce doubt that some attack was meditated upon our party. The road as we advanced seemed to afford every facility for such an unpleasant interruption. At first it winded apart from the lake through marshy meadow ground overgrown with copsewood, now traversing dark and close thickets which would have admitted an ambuscade to be sheltered within a few yards of our line of march, and frequently crossing rough mountain torrents, some of which took the soldiers up to the knees, and ran with such violence that their force could only be stemmed by the strength of 2 or 3 men holding fast by each other's arms. It certainly appeared to me, though altogether unacquainted with military affairs, that a sort of half savage warriors, as I had heard the Highlanders asserted to be, might, in such passes as these, attack a party of regular forces with great advantage. The Bailie's good sense and shrewd observation had led him to the same conclusion, as I understood from his requesting to speak with the captain, whom he addressed nearly in the following terms: "Captain, it's no to fleech any favour I to you, for I scorn it, and it's under protest that I reserve my action and pleas of oppression and wrongous imprisonment; but being a friend to King George and his army, I'd take the liberty to speir. Dinna ye think ye might take a better time to gang up this glen? If ye are seeking a Rob Roy, he's ken'd to be better than half 100 men strong when he's at the fewest; and if he brings in the Glengyle folk, and the Glenfinlas and Balquhidder lads, he may come to gie ye your kail through the reek; and it's my sincere advice, as a king's friend, ye had better tak back again to the Clachan, for the women at Aberfoil, like the Scarrets and Seymours at the Cumries, there's foul weather follies they're skirting." "Make yourself easy, sir," replied Captain Thornton. "I am in the execution of my orders. And as you say you are a friend to King George, you will be glad to learn that it is impossible that this gang of ruffians, whose license has disturbed the country so long, can escape the measures now taken to suppress them. The horse squadron of militia, commanded by Major Galbraith, is already joined by 2 or more troops of cavalry, which will occupy all the lower passes of this wild country. 300 Highlanders, under the 2 gentlemen you saw at the inn, are in possession of the upper part, and various strong parties from the garrison are securing the hills and glens in different directions. Our last accounts
of Rob Roy correspond with what this fellow has confessed, that, finding himself surrounded on all sides, he had dismissed the greater part of his followers, with the purpose either of lying concealed, or of making his escape through his superior knowledge of the passes.
"I dinna ken," said the Bailie. "There's mair brandy than brains in Garschattachin said this morning, and I wouldna, if I were you, Captain, rest my main dependence on the Hieland men. Hawks willna pike out hawks in. They may quarrel among themselves, and gie ilk other ill names, and maybe a slash wi' a claymore, but they are sure to join in the longer run against the civilised folk that wear breeks on their hinder ends, and hae purses in their pouches."
Apparently these admonitions were not altogether thrown away on Captain Thornton. He reformed his line of march, commanded his soldiers to unsling their firelocks and fix their bayonets, and formed an advanced and rear guard, each consisting of a non-commissioned officer and two soldiers, who received strict orders to keep an alert lookout. Dougal underwent another and very close examination, in which he steadfastly asserted the truth of what he had before affirmed, and being rebuked on account of the suspicious and dangerous appearance of the route by which he was guiding them, he answered with a sort of testiness that seemed very natural, "Her Nainsell did not make ta road on a shentleman's lickit grand roads, she suld have paid it at Glasgow." All this passed off well enough, and we resumed our progress. Our route, though leading towards the lake, had hitherto been so much shaded by wood, that we only from time to time obtained a glimpse of that beautiful sheet of water; but the road now suddenly emerged from the forest ground, and, winding close by the margin of the loch, afforded us a full view of its spacious mirror, which now, the breeze having totally subsided, reflected in still magnificence the high dark heathy mountains, huge grey rocks, and shaggy banks by which it is encircled. The hills now sunk on its margins so closely, and were so broken and precipitous, as to afford no passage except just upon the narrow line of the track which we occupied, and which was overhung with rocks, from which we might have been destroyed merely by rolling down stones, without much possibility of offering resistance. Add to this, that as the road winded round every promontory and bay which indented the lake, there was rarely a possibility of seeing 100 yards before us. Our commander appeared to take some alarm at the nature of the pass in which he was engaged, which displayed itself in repeated orders to his soldiers to be on the alert, and in many threats of instant death to Dougal, if he should be found to have led them into danger. Dougal received these threats with an air of stupid impenetrability, which might arise either from conscious innocence or from dogged resolution. "If shentlemans were seeking to raid Gregarach," he said, "to be sure they could not expect to find her without some wee danger." Just as the Highlander uttered these words, a halt was made by the corporal commanding the advance, who sent back one of the file who formed it, to tell the captain that the path in front was occupied by Highlanders, stationed on a commanding point of particular difficulty. Almost at the same instant, a soldier from the rear came to say that they heard the sound of a bagpipe in the woods through which we had just passed. Captain Thornton, a man of conduct as well as courage, instantly resolved to force the pass in front, without waiting till he was assailed from the rear; and, assuring his soldiers that the bagpipes which they heard were those of the friendly Highlanders who were advancing to their assistance, he stated to them the importance of advancing and securing Rob Roy, if possible, before these auxiliaries should come up to divide with them the honour, as well as the reward, which was placed on the head of this celebrated freebooter. He therefore ordered the rear guard to join the centre, and both to close up to the advance, doubling his file so as to occupy with his column the whole practicable part of the road, and to present such a front as its breadth admitted. Dougal, to whom he said in a whisper, "You dog, if you have deceived me, you shall die for it," was placed in the centre, between two grenadiers, with positive orders to shoot him if he attempted an escape. The same situation was assigned to us as being the safest, and Captain Thornton, taking his half pike from the soldier who carried it, placed himself at the head of his little detachment, and gave the word to march forward. The party advanced with the firmness of English soldiers. Not so Andrew Fairservice, who was frightened out of his wits, and not so, if truth must be told, either the Bailie or I myself, who, without feeling the same degree of trepidation, could not with stoical indifference see our lives exposed to hazard in a quarrel with which we had no concern. But there was neither time for remonstrance nor remedy. We approached within about 20 yards of the spot where the advanced guard had seen some appearance of an enemy. It was one of those promontories which run into the lake, and round the base of which the road had hitherto winded in the manner I have described. In the present case, however, the path, instead of keeping the water's edge, sealed the promontory by one or two rapid zigzags, carried in a broken track along the precipitous face of a slaty grey rock, which would otherwise have been absolutely inaccessible. On the top of this rock, only to be approached by a road so broken, so narrow, and so precarious, the corporal declared he had seen the bonnets and long-barrelled guns of several mountaineers, apparently couched among the long heath and brushwood which crested the eminence. Captain Thornton ordered him to move forward with 3 files to dislodge this supposed ambuscade, while at a more slow but steady pace he advanced to his support with the rest of his party. The attack which he meditated was prevented by the unexpected apparition of a female upon the summit of the rock. "Stand," she said, with a commanding tone, "and tell me what ye seek in MacGregor's country." I have seldom seen a finer or more commanding form than this woman. She might be between the term of 40 and 50 years, and had a countenance which must once have been of a masculine cast of beauty, though now, imprinted with deep lines by exposure to rough weather, and perhaps by the wasting influence of grief and passion, its features were only strong, harsh, and expressive. She wore her plaid, not drawn around her head and shoulders, as is the fashion of the women in Scotland, but disposed around her body, as the Highland soldiers wear theirs. She had a man's bonnet with a feather in it, an unsheathed sword in her hand, and a pair of pistols at her girdle. "It's Helen Campbell, Rob's wife," said the Bailie, in a whisper of considerable alarm, "and there will be broken heads among us or it's lang." "What seek ye here?" she asked again of Captain Thornton, who had himself advanced to reconnoitre. "We seek the outlaw, Rob Roy MacGregor Campbell," answered the officer, "and make no war on women; therefore offer no vain opposition to the king's troops, and assure yourself of civil treatment." "Ay," retorted the Amazon, "I am no stranger to your tender mercies. Ye have left me neither name nor fame. My mother's bones will shrink aside in their grave when mine laid beside them. Ye have left me neither house nor hold, blanket nor bedding, cattle to feed us, or flocks to clothe us. Ye have taken from us all, all. The very name of our ancestors have ye taken away, and now ye come for our lives." "I seek no man's life," replied the captain; "I only execute my orders. If you are alone, good woman, you have naught to fear. If there are any with you so rash as to offer useless resistance, their own blood be on their own heads. Move forward, sergeant." "Forward, march!" said the non-commissioned officer. "Huzzah, my boys, for Rob Roy's head and a purse of gold!" He quickened his pace into a run, followed by the 6 soldiers; but as they attained the first traverse of the ascent, the flash of a dozen of firelocks from various parts of the pass parted in quick succession and deliberate aim. The sergeant, shot through the body, still struggled to gain the ascent, raised himself by his hands to clamber up the face of the rock, but relaxed his grasp after a desperate effort, and falling, rolled from the face of the cliff into the deep lake, where he perished. Of the soldiers, 3 fell, slain or disabled; the others retreated on their main body, all more or less wounded. "Grenadiers to the front!" said Captain Thornton. You are to recollect that in those days this description of soldiers actually carried that destructive species of firework from which they derive their name. The 4 grenadiers moved to the front accordingly. The officer commanded the rest of the party to be ready to support them, and only saying to us, "Look to your safety, gentlemen," gave in rapid succession the word to the grenadiers, "Open your pouches, handle your grenades, blow your matches, fall on." The whole advanced with a shout, headed by Captain Thornton, the grenadiers preparing to throw their grenades among the bushes where the ambuscade lay, and the musketeers to support them by an instant and close assault. Dougal, forgotten in the scuffle, wisely crept into the thicket which overhung that part of the road where we had first halted, which he ascended with the activity of a wild cat. I followed his example, instinctively recollecting that the fire of the Highlanders would sweep the open track. I clambered until out of breath, for a continued spattering fire, in which every shot was multiplied by 1,000 echoes, the hissing of the kindled fuses of the grenades, and the successive explosion of those missiles, mingled with the huzzas of the soldiers, and the yells and cries of their Highland antagonists, formed a contrast which added, I do not shame to own it, wings to my desire to reach a place of safety. The difficulties of the ascent soon increased so much that I despaired of reaching Dougal, who seemed to swing himself from rock to rock, and stump to stump with the facility of a squirrel, and I turned down my eyes to see what had become of my other companions. Both were brought to a very awkward standstill. The Bailie, to whom I suppose fear had given a temporary share of agility, had ascended about 20 feet from the path, when his foot slipping, as he straddled from one huge fragment of rock to another, he would have slumbered with his father the deacon, whose acts and words he was so fond of quoting, but for a projecting branch of a ragged thorn, which, catching hold of the skirts of his riding coat, supported him in mid-air, where he dangled, not unlike to the sign of the Golden Fleece over the door of a mercer in the Trongate of his native city. As for Andrew Fairservice, he had advanced with better success, until he had attained the top of a bare cliff, which, rising above the wood, exposed him, at least in his own opinion, to all the dangers of the neighbouring skirmish, while at the same time it was of such a precipitous and impracticable nature, that he dared neither to advance nor retreat. Footing it up and down upon the narrow space which the top of the cliff afforded, very like a fellow at a country fair dancing upon a trencher, he roared for mercy in Gaelic and English alternately, according to the side on which the scale of victory seemed to predominate, while his exclamations were only answered by the groans of the Bailie, who suffered much, not only from apprehension, but from the pendulous posture in which he hung suspended by the loins. On perceiving the Bailie's precarious situation, my first idea was to attempt to render him assistance. But this was impossible without the concurrence of Andrew, whom neither sign, nor entreaty, nor command, nor expostulation could inspire with courage to adventure the descent from his painful elevation, where, like an unskilful and obnoxious minister of state, unable to escape from the eminence to which he had presumptuously ascended, he continued to pour forth piteous prayers for mercy, which no one heard, and to skip to and fro, writhing his body into all possible antic shapes, to avoid the balls which he conceived to be whistling around him. In a few minutes this cause of terror ceased, for the fire, at first so well sustained, now sunk at once, a sure sign that the conflict was concluded. To gain some spot from which I could see how the day had gone was now my object, in order to appeal to the mercy of the victors, who I trusted, whichever side might be gainers, would not suffer the honest Bailie to remain suspended, like the coffin of Mahomet, between heaven and earth, without lending a hand to disengage him. At length, by dint of scrambling, I found a spot which commanded a view of the field of battle. It was indeed ended, and as my mind already augured, from the place and circumstances attending the contest, it had terminated in the defeat of Captain Thornton. I saw a party of Highlanders in the act of disarming that officer and the scanty remainder of his party. They consisted of about 12 men, most of whom were wounded, who, surrounded by treble their number, and without the power either to advance or retreat, exposed to a murderous and well aimed fire, which they had no means of returning with effect, had at length laid down their arms by the order of their officer, when he saw that the road in his rear was occupied, and that protracted resistance would be only wasting the lives of his brave followers. By the Highlanders, who fought under cover, the victory was cheaply bought, at the expense of 1 man slain and 2 wounded by the grenades. All this I learned afterwards. At present I only comprehended the general result of the day, from seeing the English officer, whose face was covered with blood, stripped of his hat and arms, and his men, with sullen and dejected countenances, which marked their deep regret, enduring, from the wild and martial figures who surrounded them, the severe measures to which the laws of war subject the vanquished for security of the victors. End of Volume 2, Chapter 13. Recording by Felicity Campbell, Whanganui, New Zealand.
Chapter 14 of Rob Roy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 14. Woe to the vanquished, was stern Breno's word, when sunk proud Rome beneath the Gallic sword. Woe to the vanquished, when his massive blade bore down the scale against her ransom weighed, and on the field of foughten battle still woe knows no limits save the victor's will. The Gaudiard. I anxiously endeavoured to distinguish Dougal among the victors. I had little doubt that the part he had played was assumed, on purpose to lead the English officer into the defile, and I could not help admiring the address with which the ignorant and apparently half brutal savage had veiled his purpose, and the affected reluctance with which he had suffered to be extracted from him the false information which it must have been his purpose from the beginning to communicate. I foresaw we should incur some danger on approaching the victors in the first flush of their success, which was not unstained with cruelty, for 1 or 2 of the soldiers, whose wounds prevented them from rising, were poniarded by the victors, or rather by some ragged Highland boys who had mingled with them. I concluded, therefore, it would be unsafe to present ourselves without some mediator, and as Campbell, whom I now could not but identify with the celebrated freebooter Rob Roy, was nowhere to be seen, I resolved to claim the protection of his emissary, Dougal. After gazing everywhere in vain, I at length retraced my steps to see what assistance I could individually render to my unlucky friend, when, to my great joy, I saw Mr. Jarvie delivered from his state of suspense, and, though very black in the face, and much deranged in the garments, safely seated beneath the rock in front of which he had been so lately suspended. I hastened to join him and offer my congratulations, which he was at first far from receiving in the spirit of cordiality with which they were offered. A heavy fit of coughing scarce permitted him breath enough to express the broken hints which he threw out against my sincerity. "Ha, ha, ha! Ye say a friend A friend sticketh closer than a brother. When I came up here, Master Osbaldistone, to this country, cursed of God and man, and forgive me for swearing, on nae man's errand but yours, do you think it was fair to leave me first to be shot or drowned between Redward Highlanders and Redcoats, and next to be hung up between heaven and earth like an old potato bogle, without sae muckle as trying to relieve me? I made 1,000 apologies, and laboured so hard to represent the impossibility of my affording him relief by my own unassisted exertions, that at length I succeeded, and the Bailie, who was as placable as hasty in his temper, extended his favour to me once more. I next took the liberty of asking him how he had contrived to extricate himself. "Me extricate? I might hang there till the day of judgment, or I could hae helped mysell, wi' my head hanging down on the tae side, and my heels on the t'other, like the yon scales in the weigh house. It was the creature Dougal that extricated me, as he did yestreen. He cut it at the tails of my coat with his dirk, and another gillie and him set me on my legs as cleverly as if I had never been aft. But to see what a thing good braidcloth is, had I been in ony o' your rotten French comlets now, or your drab de berries, it would hae screeded like an old rug with sic a weight as mine. But fair fa the weaver that wrought the weft o't, I swung and bobbit yonder as safe as a gabbart that's mirrored by a 3-ply cable at the Broomielaw." I now inquired what had become of his preserver. "The creature," so he continued to call the Highland man, "contrived to let me ken there wad be danger in going near the leddy till he came back, and bade me stay here. I'm oath mind," he continued, "that he's seeking after you. It's a considerate creature, and troth I wad swear he was right about the lady as he calls her too. Helen Campbell was nane of the maist douce maidens, nor weakest wives neither, and folk say that Rob himself stands in awe of her. I doubt she winna ken me, for it's mony years since we met. I'm clear frae waiting for the Dougal creature, or we gang near her." I signified my acquiescence in this reasoning, but it was not the will of fate that day that the Bailie's prudence should profit himself or any one else. Andrew Fairservice, though he had ceased to caper on the pinnacle upon the cessation of the firing which had given occasion for his whimsical exercise, continued, as perched on the top of an exposed cliff, too conspicuous an object to escape the sharp eyes of the Highlanders, when they had time to look a little around them. We were apprised he was discovered by a wild halloo set up among the assembled victors, 3 or 4 of whom instantly plunged into the copsewood, and ascended the rocky side of the hill in different directions towards the place where they had discovered this whimsical apparition. Those who arrived first within gunshot of poor Andrew did not trouble themselves to offer him any assistance in the ticklish posture of his affairs, but, levelling their long Spanish-barrelled guns, gave him to understand, by signs which admitted of no misconstruction, that he must contrive to come down and submit himself to their mercy, or to be marked at from beneath, like a regimental target set up for ball practice. With such a formidable hint for venturous exertion, Andrew Fairservice could no longer hesitate. The more imminent peril overcame his sense of that which seemed less inevitable, and he began to descend the cliff at all risks. Clutching to the ivy and oak stumps, and projecting fragments of rock, with an almost feverish anxiety,
and never failing, as circumstances left him a hand at liberty, to extend it to the plaided gentry below in an attitude of supplication, as if to deprecate the discharge of their levelled firearms. In a word, the fellow, under the influence of a counteracting motive for terror, achieved a safe descent from his perilous eminence, which I verily believe nothing but the fear of instant death could have moved him to attempt. The awkward mode of Andrew's descent greatly amused the Highlanders below, who fired a shot or two while he was engaged in it, without the purpose of injuring him, as I believe, but merely to enhance the amusement they derived from his extreme terror, and the superlative exertions of agility to which it excited him. At length he attained firm and comparatively level ground, or rather, to speak more correctly, his foot slipping at the last point of descent, he fell on the earth at his full length, and was raised by the assistance of the Highlanders who stood to receive him, and who, ere he gained his legs, stripped him, not only of the whole contents of his pockets, but of periwig, hat, coat, doublet, stockings, and shoes, performing the feat with such admirable celerity, that, although he fell on his back, a well-clothed and decent burgher seeming serving man, he arose, a forked, uncased, bald-pated, beggarly looking scarecrow, without respect to the pain which his undefended toes experienced from the sharp encounter of the rocks over which they hurried him. Those who had detected Andrew proceeded to drag him downward towards the road through all the intervening obstacles. In the course of their descent, Mr. Jarvie and I became exposed to their lynx-eyed observation, and instantly half a dozen of armed Highlanders thronged around us, with drawn dirks and swords pointed at our faces and throats, and cocked pistols presented against our bodies. To have offered resistance would have been madness, especially as we had no weapons capable of supporting such a demonstration. We therefore submitted to our fate, and with great roughness on the part of those who assisted at our toilette, were in the act of being reduced to as unsophisticated a state, to use King Lear's phrase, as the plumeless biped Andrew Fairservice, who stood shivering, between fear and cold, at a few yards' distance. Good chance, however, saved us from this extremity of wretchedness, for, just as I had yielded up my cravat, a smart Steinkirk by the way and richly laced, and the Bailie had been disrobed of the fragments of his riding coat, entered Dougal, and the scene was changed. By a high tone of expostulation, mixed with oaths and threats, as far as I could conjecture the tenor of his language from the violence of his gestures, he compelled the plunderers, however reluctant, not only to give up their further depredations on our property, but to restore the spoil they had already appropriated. He snatched my cravat from the fellow who had seized it, and twisted it, in the zeal of his restitution, around my neck with such suffocating energy as made me think that he had not only been, during his residence at Glasgow, a substitute of the jailer, but must moreover have taken lessons as an apprentice of the hangman. He flung the tattered remnants of Mr. Jarvie's coat around his shoulders, and, as more Highlanders began to flock towards us from the high road, he led the way downwards, directing and commanding the others to afford us, but particularly the Bailie, the assistance necessary to our descending with comparative ease and safety. It was, however, in vain that Andrew Fairservice employed his lungs in obsecrating a share of Dougal's protection, or at least his interference to procure restoration of his shoes. "Na, na," said Dougal in reply, "she's no gentle poddy, I trow. Her betters hae ganged barefoot, or she's muckle mista'en." And leaving Andrew to follow at his leisure, or rather at such leisure as the surrounding crowd were pleased to indulge him with, he hurried us down to the pathway in which the skirmish had been fought, and hastened to present us as additional captives to the female leader of his band. We were dragged before her accordingly, Dougal fighting, struggling, screaming as if he were the party most apprehensive of hurt, and repulsing by threats and efforts all those who attempted to take a nearer interest in our capture than he seemed to do himself. At length we were placed before the heroine of the day, whose appearance, as well as those of the savage, uncouth, yet martial figures who surrounded us, struck me, to own the truth, with considerable apprehension. I do not know if Helen MacGregor had personally mingled in the fray, and indeed I was afterwards given to understand the contrary; but the specks of blood on her brow, her hands and naked arms, as well as on the blade of her sword, which she continued to hold in her hand, her flushed countenance, and the disordered state of the raven locks which escaped from under the red bonnet and plume that formed her headdress, seemed all to intimate that she had taken an immediate share in the conflict. Her keen black eyes and features expressed an imagination inflamed by the pride of gratified revenge and the triumph of victory, yet there was nothing positively sanguinary or cruel in her deportment, and she reminded me, when the immediate alarm of the interview was over, of some of the paintings I had seen of the inspired heroines in the Catholic churches of France. She was not, indeed, sufficiently beautiful for a Judith, nor had she the inspired expression of features which painters have given to Deborah, or to the wife of Heber the Kenite, at whose feet the strong oppressor of Israel, who dwelled in Harosheth of the Gentiles, bowed down, fell, and lay a dead man. Nevertheless, the enthusiasm by which she was agitated gave her countenance and deportment, wildly dignified in themselves, an air which made her approach nearly to the ideas of those wonderful artists who gave to the eye the heroines of Scripture history. I was uncertain in what terms to accost a personage so uncommon, when Mr. Jarvie, breaking the ice with a preparatory cough, for the speed with which he had been brought into her presence had again impeded his respiration, addressed her as follows:
I am very happy to have this joyful opportunity.
A quaver in his voice strongly belied the emphasis which he studiously laid on the word joyful.
This joyful occasion,
he resumed, trying to give the adjective a more suitable accentuation,
to wish my kinsman Robin's wife a very good morning. How's are we ye?
By this time he had talked himself into his usual jog-trot manner, which exhibited a mixture of familiarity and self-importance.
How's are we ye this lang time? Ye'll have forgotten me, Mrs. MacGregor Campbell, as your cousin. But ye'll mind my father, Deacle Nicol Jarvie, in the South Margaret of Glasgow. An honest man he was, and responsible and respect here and yours. So, as I said before, I'm right glad to see ye, Mrs. MacGregor Campbell, as my kinsman's wife. I would crave the liberty of a kinsman to salute ye, but that your gillies keep such a doleful fast hold on my arms. And, to speak heaven's truth unto magistrates, ye wouldna be the worse of a cogful of water before ye are welcome to our friends.
There was something in the familiarity of this introduction which ill suited the exalted state of temper of the person to whom it was addressed, then busied with distributing dooms of death, and warm from conquest in a perilous encounter. "What fellow are you," she said, "that dare to claim kindred with the MacGregor, and neither wear his dress nor speak his language? What are ye that have the tongue and the habit of the hound, and yet seek to lie down with the deer?"
"I dinna ken," said the undaunted Bailie, "if the kindred was ever been weel read out to you yet, cousin, but it's kenned and can be proved. My mother, Elspeth MacFarlane, was the wife of my father, Deacon Nicol Jarvie, peace be with them both, and Elspeth was the daughter of Pauline MacFarlane at the Shilling of Lochsloy. No, this Pauline MacFarlane,
as a surviving daughter, Maggie MacFarlane, alias MacNab, who married Duncan MacNab of Ostracarlacan, can testify, stood as near to your good man Robert MacGregor as in the fourth degree of kindred, for the virago lopped the genealogical tree by demanding haughtily, if a stream of rushing water acknowledge any relation with the portion withdrawn from it for the mean domestic uses of those who dwelt on its banks? Very true, kinswoman, said the Bailie, but for all that, the Baron would be glad to hae the mill dam back again in summer, when the chuggy stains are white in the sun. I ken weel enough, ye Highland folk, how does Glasgow people late and cheap for our language and our plays, but everybody speaks their native tongue that they learned in infancy, and it would be a daft like thing to see me with my fat wame in a short Highland coat, and my poor short horse gartered below the knee like ane o' your long-legged gillies. Mair by token, kinswoman, he continued, in defiance of various intimations by which Dougal seemed to recommend silence, as well as of the maximum patience which the Amazon evinced at his loquacity, I would have ye to mind that the king's errand whiles comes in the Cadger's gate, and that, for as high as ye may think of the good man, as it's right every wife should honour her husband, there's scripture warrant for that. Yet as high as ye heard him, as I was saying, I have been serviceable to Rob Ernu, for by a set of pearlings I sent yourself when ye was going to be married, and when Rob was an honest weel-doing drover, and none of this unlawful work, with fighting and flashes and froth gibs, disturbing the king's peace and disarming his soldiers. He had apparently touched on a key which his kinswoman could not brook. She drew herself up to her full height, and betrayed the acuteness of her feelings by a laugh of mingled scorn and bitterness. Yes, she said, you, and such as you, might claim a relation to us, when we stooped to be the paltry wretches fit to exist under your dominion, as your heels of wood and drawers of water, to find cattle for your banquets, and subjects for your laws to oppress and trample on. But now we are free, free by the very act which left us neither house nor hearth, food nor covering, which bereaved me of all, and makes me groan when I think I must still cumber the earth for other purposes than that of vengeance. And I will carry on the work this day has so well commenced, by a deed that shall break all bonds between MacGregor and the Lowland churls. Here, Allan, Dougal, bind these Sassenachs neck and heel together, and throw them into the Highland Loch to seek for their Highland kinsfolk. The Bailie, alarmed at this mandate, was commencing an expostulation, which probably would have only inflamed the violent passions of the person whom he addressed, when Dougal threw himself between them, and in his own language, which he spoke with a fluency and rapidity strongly contrasted by the slow, imperfect, and idiot-like manner in which he expressed himself in English, poured forth what I doubt not was a very animated pleading in our behalf. His mistress replied to him, or rather cut short his harangue, by exclaiming in English, as if determined to make us taste in anticipation the full bitterness of death, "Best dog and son of a dog, do you dispute my commands? Should I tell you to cut out their tongues, and put them in each other's throats, to try which would their best canap southron, or to tear out their hearts and put them into each other's breasts, to see which would their best plot treason against the MacGregor? And such things have been done of old in the day of revenge, when our fathers had wrongs to redress. Should I command you to do this, would it be your part to dispute my orders?" To be sure, Dougal replied with accents of profound submission, "Her pleasure should be done, that's but reason; but an it were, that is, an it could be thought the same to her, to coop the ill forlorn at a red coat captain and him's corporal cramp, and to street other red coats into the loch, itself would do't me muckle mair great satisfaction than to hae to honest civil gentlemans as were friends to the Glencarrick, and came up on the chief's assurance, and not to do no treason, as herself could testify."
The lady was about to reply, when a few wild strains of a pibroch were heard advancing up the road from Aberfoil, the same probably which had reached the ears of Captain Thornton's rear guard, and determined him to force his way onward, rather than return to the village on finding the pass occupied. The skirmish being of very short duration, the armed men, who followed this martial melody, had not, although quickening their march when they heard the firing, been able to arrive in time sufficient to take any share in the rencontre. The victory, therefore, was complete without them, and they now arrived only to share in the triumph of their countrymen. There was a marked difference betwixt the appearance of these newcomers and that of the party by which our escort had been defeated, and it was greatly in favour of the former. Among the Highlanders who surrounded the chieftainess, if I may presume to call her so without offence to grammar, were men in the extremity of age, boys scarce able to bear a sword, and even women, all, in short, whom the last necessity urges to take up arms; and it added a shade of bitter shame to the dejection which clouded Thornton's manly countenance, when he found that the numbers and position of a foe, otherwise so despicable, had enabled them to conquer his brave veterans. But the 30 or 40 Highlanders who now joined the others were all men in the prime of youth or manhood, active, clean made fellows, whose short hose and belted plaids set out their sinewy limbs to the best advantage. Their arms were as superior to those of the first party as their dress and appearance. The followers of the female chief had axes, scythes, and other antique weapons in aid of their guns, and some had only clubs, daggers, and long knives. But of the second party, most had pistols at the belt, and almost all had dirks hanging at the pouches which they wore in front. Each had a good gun in his hand, and a broadsword by his side, besides a stout round target made of light wood, covered with leather, and curiously studded with brass, and having a steel spike screwed into the centre. These hung on their left shoulder during a march, or while they were engaged in exchanging fire with the enemy, and were worn on their left arm when they charged with sword in hand. But it was easy to see that this chosen band had not arrived from a victory such as they found their ill-appointed companions possessed of. The pibroch sent forth occasionally a few wailing notes expressive of a very different sentiment from triumph, and when they appeared before the wife of their chieftain, it was in silence, and with downcast and melancholy looks. They paused when they approached her, and the pipes again sent forth the same wild and melancholy strain. Helen rushed towards them with a countenance in which anger was mingled with apprehension. "What means this, Alastair?" she said to the minstrel. "Why a lament in the moment of victory? Robert, Hamish, where's the MacGregor? Where's your father?" Her sons, who led the band, advanced with slow and irresolute steps towards her, and murmured a few words in Gaelic, at hearing which she set up a shriek that made the rocks ring again, in which all the women and boys joined, clapping their hands and yelling as if their lives had been expiring in the sound. The mountain echoes, silent since the military sounds of battle had ceased, had now to answer these frantic and discordant shrieks of sorrow, which drove the very night birds from their haunts in the rocks, as if they were startled to hear orgies more hideous and ill-omened than their own, performed in the face of open day. "Taken!" replied Helen, when the clamour had subsided. "Taken! Captive! And ye live to say so? Coward dogs, did I nurse you for this, that ye should spare your blood on your father's enemies, or see him prisoner and come back to tell it?" The sons of MacGregor, to whom this expostulation was addressed, were youths of whom the eldest had hardly attained his 20th year. Hamish, or James, the elder of these youths, was the tallest by a head, and much handsomer than his brother. His light blue eyes, with a profusion of fair hair, which streamed from under his smart blue bonnet, made his whole appearance a most favourable specimen of the Highland youth. The younger was called Robert, but, to distinguish him from his father, the Highlanders added the epithet Oig, or the young. Dark hair and dark features, with a ruddy glow of health and animation, in a form strong and well set beyond his years, completed the sketch of the young mountaineer. Both now stood before their mother with countenances clouded with grief and shame, and listened, with the most respectful submission, to the reproaches with which she loaded them. At length, when her resentment appeared in some degree to subside, the eldest, speaking in English, probably that he might not be understood by their followers, endeavoured respectfully to vindicate himself and his brother from his mother's reproaches. I was so near him as to comprehend much of what he said, and as it was of great consequence to me to be possessed of information in this strange crisis, I failed not to listen as attentively as I could. The MacGregor, his son stated, had been called out upon a trysting with the Lowland Hallion, who came with a token from. He muttered the name very low, but I thought it sounded like my own. The MacGregor, he said, accepted of the invitation, but commanded the Saxon who brought the message to be detained, as a hostage, that good faith should be observed to him. Accordingly he went to the place of appointment, which had some wild Highland name that I cannot remember, attended only by Angus Breck and little Rory, commanding no one to follow him. Within half an hour Angus Breck came back with the doleful tidings that the MacGregor had been surprised and made prisoner by a party of Lennox militia under Galbraith of Garschattachin. He added, that Galbraith, on being threatened by MacGregor, who upon his capture menaced him with retaliation on the person of the hostage, had treated the threat with great contempt, replying, let each side hang his man, we'll hang the thief, and your caterans may hang the gauger rob, and the country will be rid of two damned things at once, a wild Highlander and a revenue officer. Angus Breck, less carefully looked to than his master, contrived to escape from the hands of the captors, after having been in their custody long enough to hear this discussion, and to bring off the news. And did ye learn this, ye false-hearted traitor? Said the wife of MacGregor, and not instantly rush to your father's rescue to bring him off, and leave your body on the place? The young MacGregor modestly replied by representing the very superior force of the enemy, and stated that as they made no preparation for leaving the country, he had fallen back up the glen with the purpose of collecting a band sufficient to attempt a rescue with some tolerable chance of success. At length, he said, the militiamen would quarter, he understood, in the neighbouring house of Gartartan, or the old castle in the port of Monteith, or some other stronghold, which, although strong and defensible, was nevertheless capable of being surprised, could they but get enough of men assembled for the purpose. I understood afterwards that the rest of the freebooters' followers were divided into two strong bands, one destined to watch the remaining garrison of Inverness, a party of which, under Captain Thornton, had been defeated, and another to show front to the Highland clans who had united with the regular troops and Lowlanders in this hostile and combined invasion of that mountainous and desolate territory, which, lying between the lakes of Loch Lomond, Loch Katrine, and Loch Ard, was at this time currently called Rob Roy's, or the MacGregor country. Messengers were dispatched in great haste, to concentrate, as I supposed, their forces with a view to the purposed attack on the Lowlanders; and the dejection and despair, at first visible on each countenance, gave place to the hope of rescuing the leader, and to the thirst of vengeance. It was under the burning influence of the latter passion that the wife of MacGregor commanded that the hostage exchanged for his safety should be brought into her presence. I believe her sons had kept this unfortunate wretch out of her sight, for fear of the consequences; but if it was so, their humane precaution only postponed his fate. They dragged forward at her summons a wretch already half dead with terror, in whose agonised features I recognised, to my horror and astonishment, my old acquaintance Morris. He fell prostrate before the female chief with an effort to clasp her knees, from which she drew back, as if his touch had been pollution, so that all he could do in token of the extremity of his humiliation was to kiss the hem of her plaid. I never heard entreaties for life poured forth with such agony of spirit. The ecstasy of fear was such, that instead of paralysing his tongue, as on ordinary occasions, it even rendered him eloquent, and with cheeks pale as ashes, hands compressed in agony, eyes that seemed to be taking their last look of all mortal objects, he protested with the deepest oath his total ignorance of any design on the person of Rob Roy, whom he swore he loved and honoured as his own soul. In the inconsistency of his terror, he said he was but the agent of others, and he muttered the name of Rashleigh. He prayed but for life, he would give all he had in the world. It was but life he asked, life, if it were to be prolonged under tortures and privations. He asked only breath, though it should be drawn in the damps of the lowest caverns of their hills. It is impossible to describe the scorn, the loathing and contempt with which the wife of MacGregor regarded this wretched petitioner for the poor boon of existence. "I could have bid ye live," she said, "had life been to you the same weary and wasting burden that it is to me, that it is to every noble and generous mind. But ye, wretch, ye could creep through the world, unaffected by its various disgraces, its ineffable miseries, its constantly accumulating masses of crime and sorrow. Ye could live and enjoy yourself, while the noble minded are betrayed, while nameless and birthless villains tread on the neck of the brave and the long descended. Ye could enjoy yourself like a butcher's dog in the shambles, battening on garbage, when the slaughter of the oldest and best went on around you. This enjoyment you shall not live to partake of. Ye shall die, best dog, and that before yon cloud has passed over the sun." She gave a brief command in Gaelic to her attendants, two of whom seized upon the prostrate suppliant, and hurried him to the brink of a cliff which overhung the flood. He set up the most piercing and dreadful cries that fear ever uttered. I may well term them dreadful, for they haunted my sleep for years afterwards. As the murderers, or executioners, call them as you will, dragged him along, he recognised me even in that moment of horror, and exclaimed, in the last articulate words I ever heard him utter, "Oh, Mr. Osbaldistone, save me! Save me!" I was so much moved by this horrid spectacle, that although in momentary expectation of sharing his fate, I did attempt to speak in his behalf, but, as might have been expected, My interference was sternly disregarded. The victim was held fast by some, while others, binding a large heavy stone in a plait, tied it round his neck, and others again eagerly stripped him of some part of his dress. Half naked, and thus manacled, they hurled him into the lake, there about 12 feet deep, with a loud halloo of vindictive triumph, above which, however, his last death shriek, the yell of mortal agony, was distinctly heard. The heavy burden splashed in the dark blue waters, and the Highlanders, with their pole axes and swords, watched an instant to guard, lest, extricating himself from the load to which he was attached, the victim might have struggled to regain the shore. But the knot had been securely bound, the wretched man sunk without effort. The waters, which his fall had disturbed, settled calmly over him, and the unit of that life for which he had pleaded so strongly was for ever withdrawn from the sum of human existence. End of Volume 2, Chapter 14. Recording by Felicity Campbell, Whanganui, New Zealand. Chapter 15 of Rob Roy. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 15. And be he safe restored ere evening set, or, if there's vengeance in an injured heart, and power to wreak it in an armed hand, your land shall ache for it. Old Play. I know not why it is that a single deed of violence and cruelty affects our nerves more than when these are exercised on a more extended scale. I had seen that day several of my brave countrymen fall in battle. It seemed to me that they met a lot appropriate to humanity, and my bosom, though thrilling with interest, was affected with nothing of that sickening horror with which I beheld the unfortunate Morris put to death without resistance, and in cold blood. I looked at my companion, Mr. Jarvie, whose face reflected the feelings which were painted in mine. Indeed, he could not so suppress his horror, but that their words escaped him in a low and broken whisper. I take up my protest against this deed as a bloody and cruel matter. It is a cursed deed, and God will avenge it in his dear way and time. Then you do not fear it to follow? Said the virago, bending on him a look of death, such as that with which a hawk looks at his prey ere he pounces. Kinswoman, said the Bailie, nay man would willingly cut short his thread of life before the end of his burn was fairly measured off on the yarn winnels. And I am muckle to do, and I be spared in this world, public and private business, as well as belonging to the magistracy as to my ain particular, and nae doubt I hae some to depend on me, as poor Mattie, who is an orphan. She's a far away cousin of the Laird of Limmerfield, so that, laying others together, skin for skin, yea, all that a man hath, will he give for his life. And were I to set you at liberty, said the imperious dame, what name could you give to the drowning of that Saxon dog? Said the Bailie, clearing his throat as well as he could. I should study to say as little on that score as might be. Least said is soonest mended. But if you were called on by the courts, as you term them, of justice, she again demanded, what then would be your answer? The Bailie looked this way and that way, like a person who meditates an escape, and then answered in the tone of one who, seeing no means of accomplishing a retreat, determines to stand the brunt of battle. I see what ye are driving me to the wa about, but I'll tell you it plain, kinswoman. I be heard just to speak according to my own conscience, and though your own good man, that I wish had been here for his own sake and mine, as well as the poor Hieland creature Dougal, can tell you that Nicol Jarvie can wink as hard at a friend's feelings as anybody, yet I'll tell you, kinswoman, mine's ne'er be the tongue to belie my thought, and sooner than say that yonder poor wretch was lawfully slaughtered, I would consent to be laid beside him, though I think ye are the first Hieland woman who admit such a doom to her husband's kinsman but 4 times removed." It is probable that the tone and firmness assumed by the Bailie in his last speech was better suited to make an impression on the hard heart of his kinswoman than the tone of supplication he had hitherto assumed, as gems can be cut with steel, though they resist softer metals. She commanded us both to be placed before her. "Your name," she said to me, "is Osbaldistone? The dead dog whose death ye have witnessed called ye so?" "My name is Osbaldistone," was my answer. "Rashleigh, then, I suppose, is your Christian name?" she pursued. "No, my name is Francis." "But ye know Rashleigh Osbaldistone?" she continued. "He is your brother, if I mistake not, at least your kinsman and near friend." "He is my kinsman," I replied, "but not my friend. We were lately engaged together in a rencontre, when we were separated by a person whom I understand to be your husband. My blood is hardly yet dried on his sword, and the wound on my side is yet green. I have little reason to acknowledge him as a friend." "Then," she replied, "if a stranger to his intrigues, you can go in safety to Garschattachin and his party without fear of being detained, and carry them a message from the wife of the MacGregor?" I answered that I knew no reasonable cause why the militia gentlemen should detain me, that I had no reason on my own account to fear being in their hands, and that if my going on her embassy would act as a protection to my friend and servant who were here prisoners, I was ready to set out directly. I took the opportunity to say that I had come into this country on her husband's invitation, and his assurance that he would aid me in some important matters in which I was interested; that my companion, Mr. Jarvie, had accompanied me on the same errand. "And I wish Mr. Jarvie's boots had been full of boiling water when he drew them on for sic a purpose," interrupted the Bailie. "You may read your father," said Helen MacGregor, turning to her sons, "in what this young Saxon tells us. Wise only when the bonnet is on his head and the sword is in his hand. He never exchanges the tartan for the broadcloth, but he runs himself into the miserable intrigues of the Lowlanders, comes again after all he has suffered, their agent, their tool, their slave." "Add, madam," said I, "and their benefactor." "Be it so," she said, "for it is the most empty title of them all, since he has uniformly sown benefits to reap a harvest of the most foul ingratitude. But enough of this. I shall cause you to be guided to the enemy's outposts. Ask for their commander, and deliver him this message from me, Helen MacGregor, that if they injure a hair of MacGregor's head, and if they do not set him at liberty within the space of 12 hours, there is not a lady in the Lennox
It shall be for Christmas, cry the coronach, for them she will be loath to lose. There is not the farmer but shall sing will awa over a burnt barnyard and an empty byre. There is not the laird nor herto shall lay his head on the pillow at night with the assurance of being a live man in the morning. And to begin as we are to end, so soon as the term is expired, I will send them this Glasgow Bailey, and this Saxon captain, and all the rest of my prisoners, each bundled in a plate, and chopped into as many pieces as there are checks in the tartan." As she paused in her denunciation, Captain Thornton, who was within hearing, added with great coolness, "Present my compliments, Captain Thornton's of the Royals, compliments to the commanding officer, and tell him to do his duty and secure his prisoner, and not waste a thought upon me. If I have been fool enough to have been led into an ambuscade by these artful savages, I am wise enough to know how to die for it without disgracing the service. I am only sorry for my poor fellows," he said, "that have fallen into such butcherly hands." "Whist, whist!" exclaimed the Bailie. "Are ye weary o' your life? Ye'll gie my service to the commanding officer, Mr. Osbaldistone. Bailie Nicol Jarvie's service, magistrate of Glasgow, as his father the deacon was before him, and tell him here are wheen honest men in great trouble, and like to come to mair, and the best thing he can do for the common good will be just to let Rob come his wa's up the glen, and nae mair about it. There's been some ill doing here already, but as it is lighted chiefly on the gauger, it will be muckle worth making a stir about." With these very opposite injunctions from the parties chiefly interested in the success of my embassy, and with the reiterated charge of the wife of MacGregor to remember and detail every word of her injunctions, I was at length suffered to depart; and Andrew Fairservice, chiefly, I believe, to get rid of his clamorous supplications, was permitted to attend me. Doubtful, however, that I might use my horse as a means of escape from my guides, or desirous to retain a prize of some value, I was given to understand that I was to perform my journey on foot, escorted by Hamish MacGregor, the older brother, who, with two followers, attended, as well to show me the way, as to reconnoitre the strength and position of the enemy. Dougal had been at first ordered on this party, but he contrived to elude the service, with the purpose, as we afterwards understood, of watching over Mr. Jarvie, whom, according to his wild principles of fidelity, he considered as entitled to his good offices, from having once acted in some measure as his patron or master. After walking with great rapidity about an hour, we arrived at an eminence covered with brushwood, which gave us a commanding prospect down the valley, and a full view of the post which the militia occupied. Being chiefly cavalry, they had judiciously avoided any attempt to penetrate the pass which had been so unsuccessfully essayed by Captain Thornton. They had taken up their situation with some military skill, on a rising ground in the centre of the little valley of Aberfoil, through which the river Forth winds its earliest course, and which is formed by two ridges of hills, faced with barricades of limestone rock, intermixed with huge masses of breccia, or pebbles, embedded in some softer substance which has hardened around them like mortar, and surrounded by the more lofty mountains in the distance. These ridges, however, left the valley of breadth enough to secure the cavalry from any sudden surprise by the mountaineers, and they had stationed sentinels and outposts at proper distances from this main body in every direction, so that they might secure full time to mount and get under arms upon the least alarm.
It was not indeed expected at that time that Highlanders would attack cavalry in an open plain, though late events have shown that they may do so with success. When I first knew the Highlanders, they had almost a superstitious dread of a mounted trooper, the horse being so much more fierce and imposing in his appearance than the little shelties of their own hills, and moreover being trained, as the more ignorant mountaineers believed, to fight with his feet and his teeth. The appearance of the picketed horses feeding in this little vale, the forms of the soldiers as they sate, stood, or walked in various groups in the vicinity of the beautiful river, and of the bare yet romantic ranges of rock which hedge in the landscape on either side, formed a noble foreground; while far to the eastward the eye caught a glance of the Lake of Monteith, and Stirling Castle, dimly seen along with the blue and distant line of the Ochil Mountains, closed the scene. After gazing on this landscape with great earnestness, young MacGregor intimated to me that I was to descend to the station of the militia and execute my errand to their commander, enjoining me at the same time, with a menacing gesture, neither to inform them who had guided me to that place, nor where I had parted from my escort. Thus tutored, I descended towards the military post, followed by Andrew, who, only retaining his breeches and stockings of the English costume, without a hat, bare-legged, with brogues on his feet, which Dougal had given him out of compassion, and having a tattered plaid to supply the want of all upper garments, looked as if he had been playing the part of a Highland Tom of Bedlam. We had not proceeded far before we became visible to one of the vedettes, who, riding towards us, presented his carabine and commanded me to stand. I obeyed, and when the soldier came up, desired to be conducted to his commanding officer. I was immediately brought where a circle of officers, sitting upon the grass, seemed in attendance upon one of superior rank. He wore a cuirass of polished steel, over which were drawn the insignia of the ancient order of the Thistle. My friend Garschattachin, and many other gentlemen, some in uniform, others in their ordinary dress, but all armed and well attended, seemed to receive their orders from this person of distinction. Many servants in rich liveries, apparently a part of his household, were also in waiting. Having paid to this nobleman the respect which his rank appeared to demand, I acquainted him that I had been an involuntary witness to the king's soldiers having suffered a defeat from the Highlanders at the pass of Loch Ard. Such, I had learned, was the name of the place where Mr. Thornton was made prisoner, and that the victors threatened every species of extremity to those who had fallen into their power, as well as to the Low Country in general, unless their chief, who had that morning been made prisoner, were returned to them uninjured. The Duke, for he whom I addressed was of no lower rank, listened to me with great composure, and then replied, that he should be extremely sorry to expose the unfortunate gentlemen who had been made prisoners to the cruelty of the barbarians into whose hands they had fallen, but that it was folly to suppose that he would deliver up the very author of all these disorders and offences, and so encourage his followers in their licence. "You may return to those who sent you," he proceeded, "and inform them that I shall certainly cause Rob Roy Campbell, whom they call MacGregor, to be executed by break of day, as an outlaw taken in arms, and deserving death by 1,000 acts of violence. That I should be most justly held unworthy of my situation and commission did I act otherwise. That I shall know how to protect the country against their insolent threats of violence, and that if they injure a hair of the head of any of the unfortunate gentlemen whom an unlucky accident has thrown into their power, I will take such ample vengeance, that the very stones of their glens shall sing woe for it this 100 years to come." I humbly begged leave to remonstrate respecting the honourable mission imposed on me, and touched upon the obvious danger attending it, when the noble commander replied, that such being the case, I might send my servant.
"The deil be in my feet," said Andrew, without either having respect to the presence in which he stood, or waiting till I replied, "the deil be in my feet if I gang my tae's length. Do the folk think I hae another thrapple in my pouch after John Hielandman sneaked this one with his jocked leg, or that I can dive down at the tae side of a Highland loch and rise at the t'other like a sheldrake? No, no, ilk for himsell, and God for us all. Folk may just make a page of their ain age, and serve themselves till their bairns grow up, and gang their ain errands for Andrew. Rob Roy never came near the parish of Dreep daily to steal either pippin or pear frae me or mine."
Silencing my follower with some difficulty, I represented to the Duke the great danger Captain Thornton and Mr. Jarvie would certainly be exposed to, and entreated he would make me the bearer of such modified terms as might be the means of saving their lives. I assured him I should decline no danger if I could be of service; but from what I had heard and seen, I had little doubt they would be instantly murdered should the chief of the outlaws suffer death. The Duke was obviously much affected. It was a hard case, he said, and he felt it as such; but he had a paramount duty to perform to the country. Rob Roy must die. I own it was not without emotion that I heard this threat of instant death to my acquaintance Campbell, who had so often testified his goodwill towards me. Nor was I singular in the feeling, for many of those around the Duke ventured to express themselves in his favour. It would be more advisable, they said, to send him to Stirling Castle, and there detain him a close prisoner, as a pledge for the submission and dispersion of his gang. It were a great pity to expose the country to be plundered, which, now that the long nights approached, it would be found very difficult to prevent, since it was impossible to guard every point, and the Highlanders were sure to select those that were left exposed. They added, that there was great hardship in leaving the unfortunate prisoners to the almost certain doom of massacre denounced against them, which no one doubted would be executed in the first burst of revenge. Garschattachin ventured yet farther, confiding in the honour of the nobleman whom he addressed, although he knew he had particular reasons for disliking their prisoner. "Rob Roy," he said, "though a kittle neighbour to the Low Country, and particularly obnoxious to his Grace, and though he maybe carried the cutter and trade farther than ony man o' his day, was an old friend call, and there might be some means of making him hear reason, whereas his wife and sons were reckless fiends, without either fear or mercy about them, and at the head o' his limmerleens, would be a worse plague to the country than ever he had been." "Phew, phew," replied his Grace, "it is the very sense and cunning of this fellow which has so long maintained his reign. A mere Highland robber would have been put down in as many weeks as he has flourished years. His gang, without him, is no more to be dreaded as a permanent annoyance, it will no longer exist, than a wasp without its head, which may sting once perhaps, but is instantly crushed into annihilation." Garschattachin was not so easily silenced. "I am sure, my Lord Duke," he replied, "I have no favour for Rob, and he as little for me, seeing he has twice cleaned out my ain byres, besides scathe amang my tenants. But, however, Garschattachin," said the Duke with a smile of peculiar expression, "I fancy you think such a freedom may be pardoned in a friend's friend, and Rob's supposed to be no enemy to Major Galbraith's friends over the water." "If it be so, my lord," said Garschattachin in the same tone of jocularity, is not the worst thing I have heard of him. But I wish we heard some news from the clans that we have waited for so long. I vow to God they'll keep a Hielandman's word with us. I never kenned them better. It's ill drawing boots upon trees." "I cannot believe it," said the Duke. "These gentlemen are known to be men of honour, and I must necessarily suppose they are to keep their appointment. Send out 2 more horsemen to look for our friends. We cannot, till their arrival, pretend to attack the pass where Captain Thornton has suffered himself to be surprised, and which, to my knowledge, 10 men on foot might make good against a regiment of the best horse in Europe. Meanwhile, let refreshments be given to the men." I had the benefit of this last order, the more necessary and acceptable, as I had tasted nothing since our hasty meal at Aberfoil the evening before. The vedettes who had been dispatched returned without tidings of the expected auxiliaries, and sunset was approaching, when a Highlander, belonging to the clans whose co-operation was expected, appeared as the bearer of a letter, which he delivered to the Duke with a most profound congé. "Now will I wad the hogshead of credit," said Garschattachin, "that this is a message to tell us that these cursed Hielandmen, whom we have fetched here at the expense of so much plague and vexation, are going to draw off, and leave us to do our own business if we can." "It is even so, gentlemen," said the Duke, reddening with indignation, after having perused the letter, which was written upon a very dirty scrap of paper, but most punctiliously addressed, "for the much honoured hands of ane high and mighty Prince the Duke," etc., etc., etc. "Our allies," continued the Duke, "have deserted us, gentlemen, and have made a separate peace with the enemy." "It's just the fate of all alliances," said Garschattachin. "The Dutch were going to serve us the same gate, if we had not got the start of them at Utrecht." "You are facetious, sir," said the Duke, with a frown which showed how little he liked the pleasantry; "but our business is rather of a grave cut just now. I suppose no gentleman would advise our attempting to penetrate farther into the country, unsupported either by friendly Highlanders or by infantry from Inversnaid." A general answer announced that the attempt would be perfect madness. "Nor would there be great wisdom," the Duke added, "in remaining exposed to a night attack in this place. I therefore propose that we should retreat to the house of Duchray, and that of Gartartan, and keep safe and sure watch and ward until morning. But before we separate, I will examine Rob Roy before you all, and make you sensible, by your own eyes and ears, of the extreme unfitness of leaving him space for further outrage." He gave orders accordingly, and the prisoner was brought before him, his arms belted down above the elbow, and secured to his body by a horse girth buckled tight behind him. 2 non-commissioned officers had hold of him, 1 on each side, and 2 file of men with carabines and fixed bayonets attended for additional security. I had never seen this man in the dress of his country, which set in a striking point of view the peculiarities of his form. A shock head of red hair, which the hat and periwig of the Lowland costume had in a great measure concealed, was seen beneath the Highland bonnet, and verified the epithet of Roy, or Red, by which he was much better known in the Low Country than by any other, and is still, I suppose, best remembered. The justice of the appellation was also vindicated by the appearance of that part of his limbs, from the bottom of his kilt to the top of his short hose, which the fashion of his country dress left bare, and which was covered with a fell of thick short red hair, especially around his knees, which resembled in this respect, as well as from their sinewy appearance of extreme strength, the limbs of a red coloured Highland bull. Upon the whole, betwixt the effect produced by the change of dress, and by my having become acquainted with his real and formidable character, his appearance had acquired to my eyes something so much wilder and more striking than it before presented, that I could scarce recognise him to be the same person. His manner was bold, unconstrained, unless by the actual bonds, haughty, and even dignified. He bowed to the Duke, nodded to Garschattachin and others, and showed some surprise at seeing me among the party. "It's a long time since we have met, Mr. Campbell," said the Duke. "It is so, my Lord Duke. I could have wished it had been," looking at the fastening on his arms, "when I could have better paid the compliments I owe to your Grace. But there is a good time coming." "No time like the time present, Mr. Campbell," answered the Duke, "for the hours are fast flying that must settle your last account with all mortal affairs. I do not say this to insult your distress, but you must be aware yourself that you draw near the end of your career. I do not deny that you may sometimes have done less harm than others of your unhappy trade, and that you may occasionally have exhibited marks of talent, and even of a disposition which promised better things. But you are aware how long you have been the terror and the oppressor of a peaceful neighbourhood, and by what acts of violence you have maintained and extended your usurped authority. You know, in short, that you have deserved death, and that you must prepare for it." "My lord," said Rob Roy, "although I may well lay my misfortunes at your Grace's door, yet I will never say that you yourself have been the wilful and witting author of them. My lord, if I had thought so, your Grace would not this day have been sitting in judgment on me, for you have been 3 times within good rifle distance of me, when you were thinking but of the red deer, and few people had kenned me miss my aim. But as for them that have abused your Grace's ear, and set you up against a man that was ance as peaceful a man as ony in the land, and made your name the warrant for driving me to utter extremity, I have had some amends of them, and for all that your Grace now says, I expect to live to hae mair." "I know," said the Duke in rising anger, "that you are a determined and impudent villain, who will keep his oath if he swears to mischief, but it shall be my care to prevent you. You have no enemies but your own wicked actions." "Had I called myself Graham instead of Campbell, I might have heard less about them," answered Rob Roy with dogged resolution. "You will do well, sir," said the Duke, "to warn your wife and family and followers to beware how they use the gentleman now in their hands, as I will requite tenfold on them, and their kin and allies, the slightest injury done to any of his Majesty's liege subjects." "My lord," said Roy in answer, "none of my enemies will allege that I have been a bloodthirsty man, and were I now wi' my folk, I could rule 400 or 500 wild Hielanders as easy as your Grace those 8 or 10 lackeys and footboys. But if your Grace is bent to take the head away from a house, you may lay your account there will be misrule among the members. However, come out what like, there's an honest man, a kinsman of my ain, may come be nae scathe. Is there anybody here would do a good deed for MacGregor? He may repay it, though his hands be now tied." The Highlander who had delivered the letter to the Duke replied, "I will do your will for you, MacGregor, and I'll gang back up the glen on purpose." He advanced and received from the prisoner a message to his wife, which, being in Gaelic, I did not understand, but I had little doubt it related to some measures to be taken for the safety of Mr. Jarvie. "Do you hear the fellow's impudence?" said the Duke. "He confides in his character of a messenger. His conduct is of a piece with his masters, who invited us to make common cause against these freebooters, and have deserted us so soon as the MacGregors have agreed to surrender the Balquhidder lands they were squabbling about. No truth in plaids, no faith in tartan trews, chameleon like, they change 1,000 hues. Your great ancestor never said so, my lord, answered Major Galbraith, and with submission, neither would your grace have occasion to say it, would ye but be for beginning justice at the wellhead. Gie the honest man his mere again. Let every head wear its ain bonnet, and the destructions of the Lennox would be mended with them of the land. Hush, hush, Garschattachin, said the Duke. This is language dangerous for you to talk to any one, and especially to me. But I presume you reckon yourself a privileged person. Please to draw off your party towards Gartartan. I shall myself see the prisoner escorted to Duchray, and send you orders to-morrow. You will please grant no leave of absence to any of your troopers. Here's old ordering and counter-ordering, muttered Garschattachin between his teeth. But patience, patience, we may ere day play at change seats. The king's coming. The two troops of cavalry now formed, and prepared to march off the ground, that they might avail themselves of the remainder of daylight to get to their evening quarters. I received an intimation, rather than an invitation, to attend the party, and I perceived that, though no longer considered as a prisoner, I was yet under some sort of suspicion. The times were indeed so dangerous. The great party questions of Jacobite and Hanoverian divided the country so effectually, and the constant disputes and jealousies between the Highlanders and Lowlanders, besides a number of inexplicable causes of feud which separated the great leading families in Scotland from each other, occasioned such general suspicion that a solitary and unprotected stranger was almost sure to meet with something disagreeable in the course of his travels. I acquiesced, however, in my destination with the best grace I could, consoling myself with the hope that I might obtain from the captive freebooter some information concerning Rashleigh and his machinations. I should do myself injustice did I not add, that my views were not merely selfish. I was too much interested in my singular acquaintance not to be desirous of rendering him such services as his unfortunate situation might demand, or admit of his receiving. End of Volume 2, Chapter 15. Recording by Felicity Campbell, Whanganui, New Zealand.